Thank you so much, Manoj, for the very warm introduction, which is a bit nostalgic for me for many reasons. Aside from the fact that we've been long-standing colleagues, meeting a lot of ex-graduates from the Architectural Association, being back, let's call it, in the mother country of my family, and just honestly being asked to discuss and I think to share a thematic that for me was a bit of a provocation to consider what future heritage actually could mean. For me, I very much admire almost any initiative that is unapologetic in its belief in architecture and urbanism and the city, and in terms of making that accessible to people. I think a lot of the things that motivate me, my colleagues, and the reasons to come to things like this is in a sense to try to share a little bit some of the experiences that I've had the privilege to have, but also to learn more about the things that other people are doing. A lot of the language that I have heard and have read resonates with me because in some ways I think it's unsaid, but architecture and urbanism basically is really the interface of all of our interactions. I'm not a historian, I'm not a conservationist, but the word heritage for me was something that is quite important. It resonated for a lot of different reasons because in some sense it's a construction in terms of what we value in society. It's a shared and a collective attribution to the way that we live, to the way that we recognize our history, to the way that we identify with things, and like many things, is a living thing. Some of the challenges that I think that are relative to some of the initiatives that are happening here are similar to initiatives of archiving, initiatives of education, initiatives of learning. And I thought that some of the things that I could share would maybe be speaking towards a little bit of some of these strategies that have come to me and through some of the projects of Minimaforms, through some of the work that I do with students, through a lot of the conversations that we have. So a lot of the, I think, motivation for me to be propping myself up here behind the lectern is really about an admiration for the conversation and let's say a support in terms of some of the work that a lot of you are doing to make architecture accessible to people. The film director Godard had a moment in Alphaville, which was a movie that is quite interesting for me. And the reason for it is that it sort of lends itself to this whole notion of time and understanding. There's a line when one of the main characters says, "No one has lived in the past and no one will live in the future." When we speak about future heritage, I'm not necessarily sure that that means something at face value. It needs a context, and in some sense, trying to understand what heritage in itself means is also something that is open for interrogation. Cultural heritage, understood as traditions, languages, customs, beliefs, art, ways of life. Natural heritage, landscapes, ecosystems, natural features. Built heritage, historic buildings, monuments, cities, architecture. Intangible heritage, music, rituals, craftsmanship, oral histories, knowledge. Personal or family heritage, ancestry, stories, heirlooms, and shared values. A lot of the things that motivate me is, in some sense, trying to enable people to construct a shared vision. One aspect is to try to make things accessible and to try to understand and try to situate oneself within the environments that they live. The other one is a recognition that the way that we see the world and the way that we construct our understanding is a very human thing. Each of our constructions are our own, and what I will try to somehow, and let's call it the experiment of this presentation, is to stitch together some of the impacts of the contemporary condition, from technology to social responsibility, design, and other kinds of features, to be able to kind of open up a conversation around the subject of understanding and learning around this kind of idea of a collective vision, and the role that design may play in enabling a very different kind of conversation. Thomas Kuhn's, who spoke to the idea of research, and particularly within the structure of scientific revolutions, articulated it that the answers you get depends on the questions you ask. And I think that that's actually very important to understand that in many disciplines, particularly in the cultural world, we see the things through our own perspectives and we try to somehow articulate that with emotion and expression. In science, and some would say in technology, those things are refactored in a very different way. All of them are generally inattainable, intangible, ephemeral, and fleeting, always reconstructed and always part of things that are much more conversational. For me, what's very interesting is in even the most objective kind of pursuits, like on the left-hand side, you have the mathematician John Conway drawing out what would become the game of life. On the right, you have Charles and Ray Eames trying to communicate science and technology through the concept of the power of 10, trying to understand our relationship not only to each other but to the world. At times, some of the most non-human kind of ways being a mirror for the things that actually make us truly human. The endeavors for people to try to get a better sense of the way that we operate in the world, the tools that we have, the ways to develop a form of equity, to share knowledge, education, could see in very different manifestations. For example, the Whole Earth Catalog was an attempt over 3 years to document all of the tools and to construct a kind of resource for people to be able to utilize those tools in a way to better their own lives. The challenges with some of these even very optimistic and well-meaning things is that at some moment in time, it starts to become an open conversation about what now these kind of new tools offer. And in this case, the founders of the Whole Earth Catalog in the introduction basically said, we are gods and might as well get used to it. Read the first catalog statement of purpose. A realm of intimate personal power is developing, power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and share his adventure with whoever is interested. If we read this at face value, we would say it's kind of misaligned with maybe what these tools and these instrumentalizations are there for, the opportunity to actually communicate, to do things in a more shared way. The reality is that this was written in the 70s, but our reality today is much closer to these kind of statements, not in the general well-being of each other, but still with the same limitations, I think, that we find ourselves. What's interesting to look at the Whole Earth Catalog is that this room that you see in the slide was basically, let's call it the command center of this kind of information, sending postal mail address invitations to people to send and to receive all of this documentation, and in the end, to create something that, of course, became obsolete as soon as it was generated with the advent of the internet and other forms of almost immediate kind of communication. When we talk about the urban and heritage, I think that there is an important distinction between the possibilities of what future heritage is and conservation. I think when we start to think about the city, our environments, the way that we live and operate, these are constructions that are changing and ever unfolding. When we look at the architects and the designers, the urban planners, many of them, and I chose to focus on some who are Greek by nature, like Doxiadis and others, were always trying to consider architecture and urbanism as something that was dynamic, something that was lived and living, and something that was responsive in time. Those challenges, I think, continue, and just like everything, we are evolving a kind of discourse. Those discourses are shaped by the technologies that are very much a part of our everyday. Early experiments from, let's say, at the AA, from John and Julia Fraser, exploring issues of computation, the city, the urban, dealt with ideas of abstraction, things that, would be revisited in stuff like in the DRL and in my own work. Desires to think about the city that could be self-organized, could be emotive, driven by very humanistic kind of pursuits, but enabled by the idea of challenging the fixed and the finite aspect of the way that we construct our built environments. Discourses have been shaped, like adaptive ecologies and other things, to try to articulate in some ways how architecture could participate, how it could be constructed in a more polyscalar way. At the same time, this is also the reality of today. Things like the Hyperion data center, ideas and challenges of intelligence, and massive resources and energy being deployed in a way and based on our everyday interactions. So I'll speak a little bit about AI and some other things, but mostly to understand that most things that we speak about when we talk about artificial intelligence is really predicated on our behavior. The things that these systems are run on is really an understanding of ourselves. When we consider the way that we think about data, the way that we think about information, the way that we make those things accessible, today almost everything can be turned into data. For example, here, a large nature model that Refik Anadol is trying to do to catalog with all of the scientists and all the data sets that are available, all, let's call it, signs of plant life, and to make that accessible in a database. In one sense, like seed banks and other things, these become kind of acts of preservation, but in some sense, the really fundamental aspect of it is not about cataloging these things, but is about enabling a way for us to understand that our ecosystems are collapsing, and there are reasons to understand our environments much better. Unfortunately, these data sets remain, in some sense, novelty. All this information is deployed, but very few of it is actually enabled. People like James Bridle, who has made, I believe, still Athens his home, speak about technology. And many architects in the past have basically spoke to the fact that technology may be the answer, but like as Cedric Prax really asked, what was the question? And so the attempt, at least for this conversation, and for your questions after, I hope, is to kind of open up a discussion, something that sits between art, architecture, urbanism, science, and technology. Attempts from my side with my brother and others to try to look at the urban environment as a canvas. Many of the things that we do take the form of installations, are ephemeral, but they are, in a sense, trying to give voice to a shared collective. A project like Memory Cloud that we did in Trafalgar Square in the city of Detroit was an invitation for people to use the city and the buildings and to express their own personal testimonies as a form of collective action. Other projects, like this project Petting Zoo, was in a sense trying to humanize automation and robotics, to try to speak to the fact that the things that make us human are the things that make us very empathetic to all things, regardless if we know if they're alive or a machine, a robot. The interactions with things themselves, I think, open up the ability to see a very different form of communication, something that's evolving and changing. And attempts, I think, to make that kind of open and accessible and to allow people to interact with things is also to, I think, really start to consider, at least from my perspective, that if the problem is spatial, then it is architectural, and we have something to offer to the general kind of societal conversation. Many of these attempts are placed in environments that are accessible to people, that are lived. If this is in the Barbican Center, it was outside of the traditional gallery system, purposefully placed in the everyday environment, with an idea that these kind of things themselves can be humanized through interaction, through demystifying technologies, and through allowing people to have a sense of almost serious play. The same systems that operate behind the scenes of almost everything that we do could be made legible, understood with simple interactions with each other. Those becoming host conditions for a conversation, and I think conversation for me is a very important model or a framework to think about interaction and communication. A lot of these things were actually talked about in the late 60s, early 70s, and what was come to be known as second-order cybernetics. There are other people trained in architecture that have moved into different domains. Xenakis, I'm sure, is not somebody that is unknown in this context. But Yannis Xenakis actually worked in architecture, formalized his love of architecture with mathematics, and moved away from buildings into composition, and in a sense, experimenting with the mediums themselves without disciplinary distinction, and in a sense, allowing the kind of conceptual project to unfold itself. Things that resonate, I think, for me very much, because in some sense, I feel that projects actually make demands, and they force us to move down paths if we're open and honest with some integrity to follow actually where they may lead. People like Takis looked at electromagnetism, an artist and a sculptor that was trying to challenge representation. Also a character who I think is very important in sort of trying to construct, I think, an alternative to think about how one could actually work with phenomena as a form of technology. Takis Zanetos, another architect who in some sense became a forgotten modern hero of, let's call it the Greek avant-garde, had a whole, I think, series of provocations of electronic urbanism, a precursor and actually archigram and a lot of the kind of radical British groups talking about a series of cities and urban environments as cable nets, as communication, as a way of sort of seeing and thinking about what a so-called future present could be through the framework of these kinds of architectures. When we speak about heritage, Zanetos is an interesting case study. He built a fix factory here in Athens, a building that in some sense was controversial on its own right, but in a way also quite radical in its ability to conceive of an urban figuration. The realities of post-Zanetos fix factory, which is a contemporary art museum, one that took a long time and a lot of effort to manifest, I think, with all the good intentions of trying to maintain some form of semblance to Zanetos' vision between the demolition of half of the building and the reinstating of that with radically different materials is open for conversation if the word heritage in this context had meaning. I'm going to speak about certain aspects that are really looking at questions about time and our construction of understanding. A lot of the things that I've found myself very interested in comes from very unexpected ways. Through quantum physics, through ways of kind of understanding relationality. Quantum physics doesn't necessarily recognize time like we do. Someone like Carlo Rovelli will say that time is a construction. It is primarily used to organize ourselves, but time at the top of the mountain is very different from time at the bottom of the sea. Time is situated and it's relational. That means that it's not a time, it's times. And it's not understanding, it's understandings. He says reality is not things but connections. And I think in almost all forms of communication, that relationality is something that's very important. He's somebody that I've had the privilege to communicate with, and he is also someone that sees himself, or has been asked, commented on as an architect of loop quantum gravity. He likes the word architecture because it resonates from the point of view of a construction. The act of constructing understandings and relations, I think, are very important and fundamental, and his world operates really between images, mathematics, and deep conceptual structures. These have always been at the hand of architecture. If we look at Ledoux trying to generate a monument for Newton, if we look at the work of Man Ray and some of the work that has been developed since the early 1930s, we start to see that all of them are kind of open interrogations and, in a sense, trying to construct a certain relationality with the world. Today, we're looking at things that actually are indexes of some form of notion of science and technology. These are qubits, which are a very big part of quantum technologies. What's interesting about quantum technologies is that we know a lot about quantum physics, but not enough to understand why all of the technologies that are tested using these theories actually work. And yet, this is the cornerstone for pretty much all forms of interaction and engagement, an invisible infrastructure that basically operates in this world today. With my brother, I think a lot of the things that we do in Minimaforms is trying to, in some sense, use projects and interventions to enable new forms of communication. If that's in the context of Somerset House, using glass spheres and deploying them as basically looking glasses into the world, these are anti-objects. These are not images. Everything that you see is your own. And these kind of deep structures of relationality in physics, I think, are complemented by a very different endeavor, which is teaching and education in my life. So design as research is really a search. And the context of conversation there becomes about how to mutually come together to speak about things in a certain sense that are evolving, are changing, are around us, are phenomenon. My interest in kind of communicating some of these things is that at the moment, none of us are trained to be able to explore some of these issues. What motivates an understanding is just that, motivation. Doing that collectively enables people to really access very different forms of understanding. In the 60s and 70s, things were really addressed as kind of provocations. Hans Hollein basically put forward the provocation that everything could be understood as architecture. Fast forward 15 years, you see people like David Deutsch, who is a very important quantum physicist, talking about the fabric of reality and basically talking about the theory of everything. For Hollein in particular, and in a very kind of architectural way, bringing together a whole host of different kinds of artifacts, from computation to the computer to art, started to speak about the role and the transformation and the influence that that would actually have on what we called architecture. He suggested that architects have to stop thinking in terms of buildings only. Built and physical architecture, freed from the technological limitations of the past, will more intensely work with spatial qualities as well as psychological ones. The process of erection will get a new meaning. Spaces will more consciously have haptic, optic, and acoustic properties. A true architecture over time will have to redefine itself and expand its means. Many areas outside of architecture and traditional building will enter the realm of architecture, as architecture and architects will have to enter new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture. Today, we are living in a way of classification and understanding the living through an amazing abstraction of machines. Those things basically constructing an understanding that is very personal and somehow only synthesized through models of validation. In some of the work that we do, and to bring it back more directly to some of the issues around heritage, a recent project that we opened very recently, as of a month ago, was an opportunity to basically use a 15th century castle in Tivoli, Italy. The intervention is driven by a kind of thought that celebrating the 100 years of quantum physics and the 120 years of Emilio Segre, we could generate an intervention as a way of making physics publicly accessible, but also to open up this building, which had been dormant for about 30 years, as something that would be publicly accessible and a public offering. Interventions, I think, do have meaningful resonance, because direct shared experiences and bringing people together, I think, is a very important and meaningful thing to do. But the activities that they do while they're together, or the experiences that they have and shared, I think are things that stay with them and offer them the opportunity to reconsider their environment anew. For me, this was maybe the most important thing, but I'll show you some documentation of the piece. The piece itself was trying to reconstruct a black hole. Itself takes place in the courtyard, and it was an invitation to explore the castle as well, to be able to see it from the top of the castle, to be immersed within it. The castle itself, even if it's in the heart of Tivoli and has always been part of the background of everyday life, was kind of opened up to very different kinds of conversations that were happening. Even by bringing people together to think about what physics could possibly mean, or a black hole, opened up discourses and conversations that were unexpected. Unexpected for me, unexpected for the city, that saw an interest of people coming from Rome and others, and also from physicists. Physicists who came for the event to celebrate, but experienced something that was taking their work, which is also very difficult to make accessible, and using that as a way to share that in a context that was collective and shared. Giorgio Parisi here is a very famous physicist and a Nobel Prize winner. There was a former director of CERN that came to the piece. And it was an invitation to actually have a shared dialogue for usually very explicit disciplinary silos that really don't have much engagement. And space and architecture and urbanism, and especially the city, offer us a model to be able to have certain conversations. The concept of the city as a canvas, I think, is something that we've looked at very much. Memory Cloud in particular was an invitation to do an intervention in Trafalgar Square. The idea was very simple. How could we animate the built environment through conversation? Leading up to the event, we also got very particularly interesting press, potentially one of the most dramatic and obscene art events ever to be held in London, because we allowed people to basically communicate through an interface that would form a form of collective writing. We chose Trafalgar Square, which was only the third time that an artist had used actually Trafalgar Square as a canvas. It's the site of celebration, it's the site of protest, it's the site of communication. And we felt that we could hybridize one of the most ancient forms of communication that was visual and long distancing, like smoke signals, with SMS texting, allowing people to use their personal interfaces but publicly share in a spatialized form of topography, a kind of constructed atmosphere. The piece itself generated very different kinds of interactions. The collective writing opened up a discourse, everything from people trying to marry their respective others, to people communicating to lost loved ones, to people trying to just see their name in smoke. London played a host environment that also played an issue where novelty in this sense is something that's very commonplace to happen as events within the public domain. But in Detroit, it served as a very different thing, to have conversations about very difficult things through personal testimonies. And leading up to the actual event, which we did only 2 years after, and we rejected doing it anywhere else, because we felt like novelty wasn't really what we were interested in. We were interested in basically people having a voice, and to create a voice for Detroit was something that was plural and collective. And they shaped programming for 2 months that were outreach programs for young children to have haiku workshops. All of the art initiatives came together along Woodward Avenue to create a way for the 3-night event to have accessibility to people that potentially had an interest to see it or not. Most of it, though, was happening with people entering the center of Detroit, which is really unoccupied, or at the time, because the Detroit Institute of Art is closed on Saturday and Sunday. And this main facade of the building is also closed for security reasons and finance and all of the other things that some of the people today were speaking to. Creating these testimonies is also something that creates a living memory. Using it as a collective art was, in some sense, just not so much the documentation of the piece, but the testimonials that were shared. The thing that's important at times about generating projects and interventions is the impact that you have on the people that live there, not just the people that show up for art events. About 6 months after that we did the piece, we received a letter that the city of Detroit, Nadia, and others were coming together to create what would be the framework for the first light biennial of Detroit called De-Electricity. For my brother and for myself, and something that has continued, to be honest with you now, since we did the piece in 2010, it is, I think, something that we are most proud of, mostly because an ephemeral event that happened over 3 nights for a total of about 4.5 hours, brought a certain conversation to the table that wasn't mediated through normal forms of interface or anonymity, that brought the community together and then offered the ability to change the conversation. When we first were asked to do it, the question was, why do we need international so-called artists to come here and do an artwork for us? When we finished with all of that, the reality was that all we were doing was creating a platform for people. Our voice was only the enabling element to allow others to speak. The product of that was actually this, that year on year, every 2 years, the whole city gets reconsidered as a canvas for interventions for both international and for local artists. The comments that were presented were testimonies in their own right, pieces of poetry, and in a sense that opened up a certain conversation that for us was very meaningful. In Greece, we've also had the experience of working on this national park that was master planned by Renzo Piano. We were invited as artists to develop a construct, and through our participation and a lot of dialogue, we're also asked to do the illumination concept for the proposal of this. Much of what we were looking at in many ways was just, in a certain sense, using illumination to highlight the features of the park itself. Some of these things are ephemeral, some of these things are transformative, some of them are actually trying to create the opportunity for people to experience a park, to experience nature, to experience a way of also considering things like reuse and other things that are very close to, let's say, the heritage world, as part of the fundamental source materials of how we can sort of activate and also be, I think, intelligent in terms of the way that we repurpose things. As part of that, we were asked to develop 2 constructs on 2 piers. I share them not because of the design of it, but more about the strategy that we were using. One of them is an existing pier, which was a concrete pier that needed rehabilitation. The other one was a proposed new build pier. The brief from Piano's office was to speak about illumination as a lantern. Relationship of bringing the city to the sea was the primary tagline of that intervention. With a pier that was existing concrete, we decided to consider what it would be like to inhabit the light, to create an intervention that would rehabilitate the concrete pier itself, but through that also create the opportunity to use that in a way to develop more intimate ideas of what would be just more traditional seating areas, using this almost crater-like condition to create these kind of illuminated implants on the actual concrete pier. The piece itself actually really just looking at almost everyday ways of making, stuff that would be closer to designing a skateboard facility or a pool, as a way to then restructure a way that people could see and occupy a pier as an invitation for people to collect together. These kind of things were, I think, an opportunity for us to kind of speak to the possibilities of integrating not only a kind of art initiative, but a way of reusing an existing pier, reclamating certain things, and actually offering something that was actually something different. I think we generally always consider difference from a social point of view as something very important, but from an architectural point of view, we treat architecture in a very conservative way, considering and responding to aesthetics or images as a way to really somehow undermine the complexity of what it means to create space. The nautical construct was a bit different. It was thinking about its construction as really a construction, the history of naval architecture and maritime development, but at the same time also creating the possibilities for this to be created locally, but brought with new, let's call it advanced ways of thinking about aluminum welding and developing a kind of partnership to allow that to be enabled and to be water craned onto this pier. The piece itself is a surface that from the city side has no illumination, and from the seaside basically unfolds to be the lantern that Renzo Piano had sort of asked of us. I show it as a way of basically suggesting that even in the things that we can start to speak about in terms of the brief, the way of working and thinking about the creation of things, I think, is something that's important and needs as much creativity, not only in strategy, but in creation, but necessitates basically a discussion and a conversation that is much more engaged. I'm going to close with a thematic, which I think is also very important to heritage, to future heritage in my understanding of it. And that has to do much more with environmental and almost planetary kinds of issues. A lot has been said about, let's call it, the challenges that the architectural and urban world actually impacts in terms of our footprint, carbon offsetting, CLT, a lot of things that kind of offset individual buildings. But there's a recognition, I think, that the issues are much more global and planetary. And the exploration of phenomenon from an environmental point of view to sustain life, I think, is very important. A lot of the research that's been motivated over the last 10 years in the DRL have been looking at things that we've been titled more elemental architecture. The challenge of it is it shifts its understanding of architecture as a building to an architecture of infrastructure. The conversations around things are very bleak, but at the end of the day, we need to kind of enable people to have agency and to feel motivated to participate. The kinds of conversations that are mediated do a lot to demotivate people and to feel that they basically have no capacity to really engage with the larger problems. Our political systems are not necessarily helping. And I think the reality of all of these things is that at a local level and a much more grassroots level, I think that there are ways of addressing some of these things. But to understand the problem, I think, is to also look at fundamentally what we are talking about from nature, not as something that is aesthetic or something that is understood in a more nostalgic way, but in the same ways that we sort of try to understand data and information of all of our man-made systems, ways to understand the world and architecture as an infrastructure, because I think, anyway, from my perspective, we find ourselves in a moment where new ways of thinking are emerging that open up questions about agency and intelligence within a wider ecology that sustains us. Understanding actually all of the forces that shape matter, I think, is a very important part to that. So a lot of the research that we're doing in the studio is really trying to understand from wave phenomenon to growing bacteria to looking at materials that have circular life cycles. We're looking at environmental phenomenon as a way to support life and trying to look at it from a point of view that doesn't privilege, let's say, the human perspective. Looking at other forms of living intelligence and featuring those and things that we can learn from these forms of intelligence that somehow can refactor our environments, from growing architectural skins to looking at problems like desertification and other things, and trying to find ways of thinking about material phase change that can explore an understanding of the world that I think is truly something that's latent and uncertain. That seems to be the main certainty of today. If it's environmental, social, or political, the circumstances we confront are planetary. And I think that this understanding, I think, is important. Sorry, I didn't want to kill everybody with the sound wave. But also to understand that we have the capacity to work with these kind of complex systems, understanding even some of the elementary science that most of us are taught. We have the ability of starting to control and to understand things that defy our kind of everyday logic. A resting form, a resting shape, for example, these are particles that are basically suspended in air using frequency as a way to control organization. These things happen in our everyday all the time, but doing and operating through computational frameworks and so forth now today allow us for that to be time-based, for things to be explored in a way that also kind of defy logic. Could we create a form of a particle system and control things in space? Here, this experiment is trying to show that on the left, these particles can be controlled as four-dimensional. Sorry, my students have techno tracks with a lot of stuff. On the right is basically a visualization of all of the wave phenomenon that's imperceptible. And what I find really fascinating is that the digital world in architecture usually became something very representational. The act of creating was something that was really about finding ways to manufacture a form. In this case, an understanding of the world is truly time-based and truly information. And I think the fact that the students are coming and operating it, they construct experiments as discoveries. So before you saw the suspension of these kind of foam particles, now these are droplets of water or droplets of oil, because the wave phenomenon doesn't recognize material. It recognizes surface tension, it recognizes scale, it recognizes coherence of its waveforms. And you can start to really understand that the world itself is something that needs to be understood. We don't really understand our environments, neither the ones that we generate, nor the ones that we basically have been born into. I think the reality of matter itself is that it also has life cycles. I show one last project to conclude and open it up for questions, which was a project that we were looking at from the point of view of a planetary response. This was looking at everyday, let's call it material that is really deployed in the world. It took on board the subject of desertification. It looked at sand, which is a material that for the most part can be found in many parts. and was really trying to look at a way to think about infrastructure that was against trying to fight nature, but trying to work with it. So there's dunescapes that you see encroaching on many parts of the world, completely changing and destroying different kinds of ecologies. We tried to find a way that we could have an impact, and to have an impact was a discovery, finding out at a lightning field what happens when a lightning bolt actually hits the ground in the desert. What happens is that it solidifies into a glass silicate. And we felt that from that moment, that discovery, if we could actually start to change the temperature value and change sand basically into glass silicate, we could structure a very fragile but structurally strong approach to dealing with an infrastructural problem that usually gets addressed with large barriers, but with a finite, millimeter thick kind of idea of changing sand into glass. To work with the scale of things, we looked at things that were more autonomous and robotic. We looked at materials, basically looking at our workshop as an environment to do proof of concept. Tests basically to fuse sand, developing strategies which were more sand welding strategies, dealing with the world through simulation, not trying to deal with simulation as a blueprint of the world, but more as a behavioral attribute, and in a sense constructing an understanding that allowed us to be, if we want to speak about it more, in the spirit of powers of 10, in the sense of looking at from the almost microscopic into something that is vast territories of space. And everyday experiments within the studio became kind of conditioning experiments to understand that better. Simulation tools were allowed to really be used as spaces of discovery to try to understand how things work. And in a sense, a way to kind of articulate that with all of the automation and robotics in these environments, sun-driven energy would allow these kind of robots to go and become these kind of deployable, self-organizing sand welders. So a lot of this kind of experimentation and so forth was a way of just actually trying to reconsider and understand in a different way actually how things actually operate in the world. Minor sort of victories of sort of constructing some of these sand silicates became also an understanding of both its fragility, but also its reference to other forms of structures, like how an eggshell is quite strong when the yolk is inside of it and very fragile when it's empty. So those became opportunities then to prototype, develop this kind of deployable strategy of these kind of automated robots that we see in media all the time, but purposefully use them with a way of actually developing a proof of concept for a problem that is quite urgent, and developing a solution space that leveraged technology as a way to consider collaboration from a very different point of view. This is a non-human point of view. How the robots would collaborate to understand, how would they create goals, how these simple interconnected systems could be able to develop their own kind of synthetic ecology. And in the end, kind of working with things that are very off the shelf and everyday, but constructing our own ways and mechanisms to understand the world a little bit better. I think with that, I'll just leave this video as a kind of close. I think it's important, at least from my point of view, I don't know if it's clear or not, but the issue of time, I think, is very important in our reconstructing and re-understanding of things. It seems to me kind of very appropriate to kind of basically say in 2 days, tomorrow will be yesterday, and it's not a pun for how long the summit is, but it is really an understanding that the conversations that you have here and that kind of motivated engagement and that synergy which is coming through human engagement and experience and sharing those things together is very necessary for us to be motivated and to see and to understand a bit better our own agency and our agency through others. And I think that the only thing that I can basically say is that The world has a very complex set of problems that demand, I think, much more collaborative and collective models. None of the stuff that I'm showing you is anything more than shared experience that I hope from a kind of design research perspective, from, let's call it, interventions into existing heritage buildings that are motivated with kind of repurposing the way that people from the particular towns and cities saw their own buildings, is more about trying to foster a creative way to deal with the things that we have and to kind of come together for challenges that actually really don't have these territorial boundaries that have structured our societies up till now. A lot of the challenges we have forward are planetary. The ways that we can think about those problems can only be addressed in a much more collective way. And it's just an encouragement from my side, basically, to propose some alternative models of how we've been working on things that maybe hopefully can trigger something or a conversation or a response, good or bad, to some of the issues at hand. One thing about technology that was never really said by Cedric Price is that once it's out in the world, it can never really go back in the box. So the only choice that we actually have with a lot of these things is to try to humanize them and to try to work with them in a way that really starts to talk about the much more collective and shared future. So thank you for your time and the invitation. I think I left 35 minutes for questions, but I'm not sure that we need all that time for questions, do we? I'm happy to answer anything or offer a thought, if there's anything. I think there's a microphone here. Thanks.
Works it. Thank you, very interesting. Curious, could you comment a little bit more when you study so much organic, like how organics act, how do you think that it could be brought together with architecture, which is innately like a very standing and still structure, and everything that you showed us is about
dynamic.
moving and interacting?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're trying to kind of understand things, we try to look for models of organization. Like from my point of view, like I studied a lot the subject of behavior as a way of trying to understand human behavior, the way to understand systems behavior, synthetic ones, or in our ability to basically study other things. Sometimes I think those models of organization offer us, I think, a lot of ways to think about intelligence, to think about how things come together and collectively do something without a master plan. I think a lot of for example, like a termite mound, the termites themselves don't have a master plan, and yet they build these constructions that are basically models of kind of cohabitation of two species. They're environmental kind of structures that are basically water harvesting moisture to break down the wood and all of these things from the fungi that allow the termites to eat, and yet they construct a host condition. And I think for me it's just interesting to see how different models kind of operate, and especially within more of a computational point of view, that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there were a lot of people that had similar ideas, but they didn't really have access to the technology. So I look at that period of time as really thought experiments and maybe more profound questions about the possibilities of stuff. And now we have these technologies, but people are not really exploring them. And then when you think about like everyday architecture, we do a lot of work to keep our buildings appearing fixed. All of our materials have life cycles and degrade. They all have different forms of entropy. When we try to understand the world, even from a creative reuse perspective, We have a very difficult time of kind of cataloging and trying to understand all of these kind of components that are bespoke and individuated in some sense. So I think in using these things, regardless of however or whatever affinity of a style or a way that you see architecture, architecture is really, in my opinion, something that's quite lifelike. It's dealing with physics, it's dealing with behaviors, it's animated through interaction, and I feel constructing models for these things actually allow us to deal with some of the acceleration of the challenges today. Like a lot of the things in the DRL that are research agendas for us, like something like parametric urbanism, was more that offices were being asked to design cities as if they were buildings and the time frame for that. Like how do we manage complexity? How do we deal with time? And for me, most importantly, how do we deal with change? I think that we're living in a world where the only certainty is uncertainty. So trying to be motivated by looking at how different things operate in the world and doing that collectively, in a sense, finding models that are more participatory and shared, like co-authored in some sense, I think is very important. And one thing that I don't say about the DRL, but it's the primary thing, is that everything is group-based work. Students are coming internationally from all places of the world, and they're working collaboratively. And that's not an easy thing to do, especially when they're professional architects and trained in this way. So I think in method and practice, I'm just trying to find a way to enable people to be curious and to work through things, to deal with complex problems, and to find architecture and urbanism a kind of shared language. These are attempts. This is like 25 years of teaching and trying stuff. Lots of failure, but in a Samuel Beckett way, fail again, fail better, is kind of like the ethos of the studio on a day-to-day basis. And I think your points are very important because in one sense, like, this isn't about biomimicry. It's not how something looks like, it's how something works. I think this is the most important thing. Does that sort of answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you for presentation. It was really inspiring. I also really enjoyed your last point on the elaboration on the Cedric Price idea about humanizing the technology, and want to follow up on that. Like, you also showed some of the projects, and there was one, for example, on Manhattan, the Data Infrastructure Center. So I'm also like curious because AI seems to be the technology of today's, and there are a lot of also discussions of how this technology should be regulated, for example, or how we should use it and in a way humanize and make it more kind of regulated by public, because right now there are a lot of companies who have kind of a closed information about how the things are working. So I'm curious, both in your own work, do you engage with machine learning and artificial intelligence, and what is your broader perspective on how this technology should be looked from the political
point of view
perspective?
I mean, I think it needs to be understood that AI is like a 65-year-old science. I think the thing that's happened over the last 4 or 5 years is that it's become something that has caught the imagination of people with forms of diffusion models and things that have very easy entry access. And in some sense is really predicated with the way that we sort of honestly behave online, generating images, generating responses for a kind of digital culture and digital communication. I think there are a lot of risks moving forward, and that's obviously clear. And there are a lot of power structures that, to be honest with you, are not in the hands of people, and that is very alarming. On the other hand, I think there needs to be, I think, a demystification of actually where we are with these technologies, because most of the things that we understand in the media are basically what companies who have an interest in market-driven kind of investments are sharing with us. And that means that it's not as honest and it's not as explicitly legible what their capacities can or cannot do. I think if you look at it from the point of view of having a different form of collaboration, having a different form of communication, you know, the difference between using a search engine and using a ChatGPT or a large language model could be profound if done in an interesting way. Like, if we really are thinking about education and access to education, you know, this will refactor the way that we think about education if it's done the right way. If we truly think about the problems, the health problems that we have in the world, if we do this the right way, we would be able to kind of address some of the suffering just by being able to diagnose and understand things better. So I think if it's a tool of understanding, I think it's very powerful, and it's something that has a lot of possibilities that are very positive. If it continues in the path, which is really a path of control, even if it's a form of illusion, it's an enabling element for a lot of really tragedy that's happening in the world today, because it gives a license to behavior that, to be honest with you, doesn't have any social responsibility. And I think that that's something that's not just born out of AI discourses and discussions and mediation. I think that's born out of just a very different way of thinking about the individual versus the collective. I'm very much interested in collective models and participatory models, and the reason I see that is that it offers the possibility of learning and communicating and being able to actually have a shared vision, not in language, but in action, and really in terms of trying to understand really how we can deal with a lot of the pressures that all of us face every day. In the medical field, I think it's very positive. In the political field right now, the amount of control that's happening through online mediation, social media, and so forth is very troubling. But I also think that there is an awareness of that. I think people are understanding that much more, because the accelerated implications of it are so intense and so self-evident that I feel, I can't say optimistic, but I feel people have agency. My feeling about understanding technologies a little bit better is that we are living in a moment where this is truly a black box. There's not one person that really understands how all of this works. We're designing algorithms that are interfacing with other algorithms that are writing other algorithms. So this whole notion about guardrails around this is more about like a statement of purpose. It's motivated by what? To explore what, to understand what, and to better what. I think these kinds of questions people should be held accountable to. And I think we find ourselves in a really critical moment. So I'm not a proponent of AI. If you're asking me, I don't like robots, even if we explore and spend a lot of time with robots. It's very difficult for me to convince anybody otherwise when you see projects like we do. But I'm not here to sell anybody on anything. I'm just trying to share that sometimes exploring certain issues demands that you move into spaces that really challenge you. Even challenge, I think, the things that are much more personal to me. And I have the privilege of working with a lot of students that are coming to work with us from all over the world. From Lagos, from South America, from the States. Architectural education is a really powerful thing, because in certain ways it's also deeply naive. It really believes that we can change things, we can be optimistic, and I love that. Because the rest of the world doesn't operate like this. So you guys were talking about the shared generosity of people coming together. People need to come together. They need to also feel like they have the ability to change the environments that they live in, to be able to identify and to communicate them, and to be able to offer that as an invitation for different kinds of conversations that enable them to profit from other people's experiences, not only of their environment, but of other environments that maybe they don't have access to. So that was the real motivating factor why I came here today, not because I'm feeling great at the moment. But I think because I think the work that you guys are doing is important, but I also feel like the conversation of architecture and urbanism today is quite low. It's not optimistic in any way, and there's a lot of reasons why that is, but I think it's really important that we find a better way to not only make use of the things that we actually have, but also understand that some of the challenges that we face demand new models and demand a better understanding to deal with the urgency of stuff. And the only real way that we're going to respond to that is, I think, if we find a common language to work through. I think computation AI could be that. I wouldn't say it should be. But the scale of the challenges, I think, are not going to be structured on a city-by-city basis. It's not going to be a country-by-country basis. What you see in the world today is completely antithetical with a solution space for some of the things that we're facing. So I feel like to be able to respond to things, we need to be motivated, but also educate ourselves to work through some of these things and use them as tools to be, I think, if it is to be more activist, is to be more activist. Architecture, in some sense, is an interesting thing because it takes so long to actually do. It is a form of resistance in its own right. The built environment, the physical things, is completely antithetical to the digital world we operate. So I think that tension doesn't resolve itself, but I think we can profit by trying to use our environments more as opportunities to bring people together. I think that there's a lot to be said about the conversational aspect of finding solutions. I hope I'm answering your question a little bit. No? I don't know. I'm just asking. Basically, I got a lot of lights on me, like I'm a French fry or something, so I really can't see your facial expressions. Excuse me if I'm somehow standing in the dark. You guys, is there anything left to be said, or it's Saturday, time for a drink or conversation of the summit somewhere outside? Anything pressing? I think we're good. Thank you.